My name is Solid Snake. The mission that brought me to Shadow Moses was supposed to be simple. Infiltrate the base, stop a nuclear threat, and disappear without a trace. The story you are about to hear is the reason why weapons created to protect the world can sometimes become the greatest threat to it. War has a way of revealing the truth about people, and this is how it all began. The waters of Alaska were colder than I remembered. As I surfaced near the docks of Shadow Moses Island, the freezing ocean wrapped around me like a silent warning. Even through the suit designed for infiltration, the cold felt sharp and unforgiving. Snow fell slowly from the sky, drifting across the dark water and the concrete structures of the base ahead. The entire island looked lifeless at first glance, but experience told me better. Places like this were never truly quiet. Somewhere beyond the docks, soldiers were already moving, cameras were watching, and weapons were waiting. I pulled myself quietly onto the metal platform of the dock, letting the ocean water drip from the stealth suit. For a moment, I stayed still, listening. The wind carried the distant hum of machinery from deeper within the base, along with the faint crunch of boots on snow. Shadow Moses wasn't abandoned, not even close. My mission briefing echoed in my mind as I crouched near the pipes that ran along the dock wall. A group of terrorists had taken control of this nuclear disposal facility earlier that day. They called themselves Foxhound, the same special forces unit I once belonged to. That alone made the situation complicated. But the real danger wasn't the takeover of the base. It was the weapon they were threatening to use. Metal Gear, a walking nuclear launch platform capable of firing a missile from anywhere on the planet. If they were telling the truth, the world was standing closer to nuclear war than anyone realized. I moved slowly beneath the large pipes that crossed the dock entrance, keeping my body low against the metal floor. The area ahead opened into a storage section where soldiers patrolled the shadows between crates and machinery. Genome soldiers. That was what intelligence called them. Troops enhanced through genetic experiments designed to create perfect soldiers. Even from a distance, I could see the discipline in their movements. They weren't amateurs. Each patrol moved with purpose, checking corners, scanning the open dock, rifles ready. These men had been trained for war, and they believed they were protecting something important. Above me, the radar system built into my equipment displayed the movement of the guards. Each shifting dot represented a soldier walking through the snow-covered dockyard, unaware that someone was already inside their perimeter. That radar had saved my life more times than I could count. Tonight would probably be no different. As I watched the guards pass, a quiet electronic tone echoed in my ear, the familiar signal of the codec. I touched the side of my head, and the voice of Colonel Roy Campbell filled the silence. "Snake, do you read me?" Campbell had been my commanding officer years ago. Hearing his voice again brought back memories I thought I had buried, along with my military career. I answered quietly, keeping my voice low as I watched the patrols moving through the dock. Campbell explained that the elevator ahead would take me deeper into the facility, but I would have to wait for it to return to the dock level. Until then, the only option was patience. That was something infiltration missions always demanded. Rushing was how soldiers died. I settled into the shadows near a forklift parked against the wall of the dockyard. From there, I could observe the soldiers without being seen. The wind carried fragments of their conversations, small pieces of human life hidden beneath military discipline. Complaints about the cold, short jokes between patrols. Nothing unusual. To them, this was just another night of guard duty. None of them knew that the situation unfolding on this island could change the balance of the entire world. Minutes passed slowly. Snow continued to fall, covering the ground and the crates stacked along the dock. The distant lights of the facility reflected against the frozen ocean behind me. For a moment, the scene almost looked peaceful, like a quiet harbor town sleeping under winter skies. But appearances were always deceiving in places like this. Eventually, the heavy mechanical sound of the elevator returning broke the silence. A large metal platform descended into the dockyard with a low grinding noise, carrying another patrol of soldiers. They stepped out casually, stretching their arms and adjusting their rifles as if nothing unusual was happening. To them, the elevator ride was routine. To me, it was the only way deeper into the base. I waited as they scanned the area, shining flashlights briefly across the crates and containers. Their training was good, but their attention drifted quickly once they saw nothing suspicious. One by one, they moved away from the elevator, spreading out across the dockyard to continue their patrol routes. That was the moment I needed. Timing was everything in infiltration. Moving too soon would draw attention. Moving too late meant losing the opportunity entirely. I slipped quietly out of the shadows, crossing the dock floor with slow, controlled steps. The soldiers' backs were turned as they continued their patrols. Snow muffled the sound of my movement as I reached the elevator platform. The metal floor vibrated slightly beneath my boots as the machinery prepared to rise again. I stepped onto the platform and positioned myself near the wall, keeping my body hidden from the patrols outside. A moment later, the elevator doors closed with a heavy metallic clang. As the platform began to rise, the dockyard slowly disappeared beneath me. The guards continued their patrols below, completely unaware that someone had just slipped through their defenses. The elevator climbed through the interior of the facility, carrying me deeper into the heart of Shadow Moses. Somewhere above, helicopters rested on a frozen landing pad. Somewhere beyond that waited the commanders of the terrorist uprising. And somewhere inside this base stood the weapon they were threatening to unleash on the world. As the elevator ascended through the steel structure of the base, a title appeared on the screen, like the opening of a movie. Metal Gear Solid. The mission had officially begun, and there was no turning back now. The elevator rose slowly through the steel interior of the facility, carrying me deeper into Shadow Moses Island. The metal walls around me vibrated with the sound of heavy machinery, and the cold air that slipped through the structure carried the scent of oil and snow. When the platform finally stopped and the doors opened, I stepped out into the open night. The heliport stretched out before me beneath a dark Alaskan sky. Snow covered the concrete landing pad and the surrounding structures, reflecting the harsh white beams of searchlights that swept slowly across the ground. A military helicopter sat parked nearby, its silhouette looming in the freezing wind like a sleeping predator. The island felt larger from up here. Massive steel buildings rose from the frozen ground, connected by pipes, walkways, and reinforced structures designed to withstand the brutal Arctic climate. But the place wasn't just an industrial complex, it was a fortress. Guards patrolled the perimeter in careful patterns, their breath visible in the cold air as they moved between the lights. Cameras watched the open space from mounted positions along the walls. Every inch of the heliport had been designed to detect intruders. As I crouched near the edge of the platform, the familiar sound of the codec echoed softly in my ear. I activated it, and Colonel Roy Campbell's voice returned. Calm, controlled, and carrying the weight of command. "Snake, you've reached the heliport," he said. "This is where the main entry points into the base begin." Campbell began explaining the mission again in more detail, confirming the threat we were facing. The terrorists controlling Shadow Moses had made their demands clear. They wanted the remains of Big Boss. If their request wasn't granted, they would launch a nuclear missile. Hearing that name again sent an old chill down my spine. Big Boss had been more than a legend in the military world. He had been my commander, and something far more complicated than that. Campbell continued speaking, but another voice soon joined the conversation. A woman's voice, sharp and confident, carrying a quiet curiosity behind it. She introduced herself as Dr. Naomi Hunter. Naomi was the mission's geneticist, assigned to monitor the biological and genetic aspects of the operation. Her role sounded unusual for a military infiltration, but the genome soldiers guarding the island were the reason. Naomi explained that the enemy soldiers here weren't ordinary troops. They had been genetically enhanced through experimental treatments designed to push the limits of human performance. Stronger bodies, faster reflexes, heightened endurance. Soldiers built through science instead of training. Her voice carried a mix of fascination and caution as she described them. To her, they were both a military threat and a scientific experiment. Then another voice entered the conversation, softer and younger, but filled with energy. Mei Ling. She was responsible for the communication systems supporting the mission. Unlike Naomi's analytical tone or Campbell's strict professionalism, Mei Ling spoke with an almost philosophical calmness. She explained the radar system built into my equipment, describing how it would help me understand the movement of enemies and the layout of the base. But she didn't explain it like a technician. Instead, she spoke as if she were sharing a piece of quiet wisdom. Mei Ling had a habit of quoting ancient Chinese sayings and poetry, even during military briefings. In the middle of a dangerous mission, her words felt strangely peaceful, like a small reminder that the world outside this frozen island still existed. After the introductions ended, Campbell returned to the practical side of the mission. Somewhere ahead of the heliport was the entrance to the hangar complex beneath the base. There were multiple ways to reach it, but each required careful movement through enemy patrols and surveillance systems. Nothing about Shadow Moses would be straightforward. When the codec transmission ended, the night returned to silence. Only the wind and the distant hum of machinery filled the air. I moved slowly across the heliport, staying within the shadows cast by the large industrial structures surrounding the landing pad. The beams of the searchlights swept across the snow-covered ground in steady patterns, forcing me to wait and observe before crossing open areas. Patience was always the most important skill in infiltration. Rushing forward meant stepping into a spotlight, and that would end the mission before it truly began. The helicopter resting on the landing pad caught my attention as I moved closer. It was a Hind D, a powerful Soviet attack helicopter. Even sitting idle in the snow, the machine radiated power. Its heavy armor and mounted weapons made it clear that the terrorists controlling the island had serious military strength behind them. Foxhound had always been an elite unit, but the equipment gathered here suggested something larger than a simple hostage situation. As I passed the helicopter, I noticed the guards speaking quietly to one another near the edge of the landing pad. Their voices drifted through the cold air in fragments of conversation. They sounded confident, organized. Whatever their leaders had promised them, these soldiers believed in it. That belief made them dangerous. Further along the heliport stood a military truck parked near the wall of the facility. Its cargo container sat partially open, the interior hidden in darkness. I climbed inside briefly, scanning the interior. The smell of oil and metal hung in the air. It was the kind of place soldiers used to store equipment during long shifts. From there, I could observe the heliport without exposing myself to the searchlights. From this vantage point, the scale of the base became even clearer. Massive floodlights illuminated the outer structures, while pipes and ventilation systems ran along the buildings like veins feeding the entire complex. Somewhere beneath all of it lay the weapon the terrorists were threatening to use. Metal Gear. A nuclear launch platform capable of firing a missile from anywhere in the world. The thought of that machine sitting somewhere below the frozen ground of Shadow Moses weighed heavily on my mind. As I left the truck and continued moving along the perimeter of the heliport, I noticed a security camera mounted near a staircase leading upward along the structure. The camera slowly rotated back and forth, scanning the area with mechanical precision. Every movement in this place was watched by something: a soldier, a camera, a radar system. The entire island had been transformed into a fortress of surveillance. Beyond the staircase was the entrance I needed, a narrow ventilation shaft built into the structure of the building. It was the kind of entry point maintenance crews use to reach internal systems without disrupting operations. Small, quiet, and perfect for infiltration. As I approached it, the codec chimed again. Campbell's voice returned, reminding me that the ventilation ducts could provide access deeper into the base. His tone suggested he believed he was explaining something new. But by that point, I had already made my decision. Crawling through ventilation systems wasn't exactly glamorous work, but it had become a familiar part of infiltration missions. Sometimes the smallest openings were the only way into heavily guarded places. I crouched near the opening of the ventilation shaft and looked back across the heliport one last time. Snow continued to fall across the landing pad. The searchlight swept slowly across the frozen ground. Guards continued their patrols, unaware that someone had already slipped past their defenses. Shadow Moses Island looked quiet from the outside. But beneath that quiet surface, something dangerous was waiting to be uncovered. I lowered myself into the ventilation shaft and began crawling through the narrow metal tunnel. The mission was moving deeper into the base now, and with every meter forward, the truth behind the Shadow Moses incident was getting closer. The ventilation shaft was narrow and dark, the metal walls pressing close around me as I crawled deeper into the structure of Shadow Moses. The sounds of the heliport slowly faded behind me, replaced by the quiet mechanical echoes of the facility itself. Somewhere beneath the metal panels around me, machines hummed steadily, feeding power and heat through the enormous complex buried inside the frozen island. Moving through ventilation systems had never been comfortable work, but they were often the only path into heavily guarded installations. Up here, above the corridors and guard posts, I could move without being seen. But even inside the vents, the sense of being watched never completely disappeared. The codec tone suddenly echoed in my ear again. This time, the voice on the other end wasn't Colonel Campbell. The man introduced himself with the confident tone of someone who had spent most of his life in military operations. McDonnell Miller. His voice carried the relaxed familiarity of a survival instructor who had seen almost everything war could offer. Miller explained that he had been brought into the mission to provide tactical advice during the infiltration. Unlike Campbell's strict command style or Naomi's scientific curiosity, Miller spoke like someone who understood the instincts of soldiers and the environments they fought in. He talked about the island itself for a moment, the harsh Alaskan climate, the wildlife that survived in conditions most humans could barely endure. Wolves, ravens, creatures that had adapted to the cold and the darkness. In his own way, Miller seemed to be reminding me that nature had always been the original battlefield long before soldiers and weapons entered the picture. Then his tone shifted slightly. He began speaking about the genome soldiers guarding the facility. According to him, these men had been trained not only through physical conditioning, but also through carefully crafted psychological doctrine. Soldiers created to believe that they were superior to ordinary humans, the kind of belief that made people fearless and sometimes reckless. Listening to Miller, I was reminded that war wasn't just about firepower. It was about how people thought, what they believed, and what they were willing to sacrifice. The codec transmission faded, leaving me once again alone in the narrow metal shaft. I continued crawling forward until the ventilation tunnel opened into a grated section overlooking one of the interior rooms of the base. Carefully, I positioned myself near the opening and looked down through the metal slats. The room below was brightly lit compared to the darkness of the ventilation shaft. Several genome soldiers stood guard near a series of reinforced holding cells built along the walls. Their rifles hung ready across their chests as they moved through their patrol routes with disciplined precision. From above, their conversations carried clearly through the quiet room. One of the soldiers mentioned the prisoner they were holding inside one of the cells, the DARPA chief, Donald Anderson, a high-ranking official responsible for advanced weapons research within the United States government. According to the soldiers, he had already been interrogated repeatedly since the takeover of the base. The terrorists were demanding something from him, something important enough to keep him alive despite their ruthless reputation. In another cell nearby, a woman sat alone under the dim lighting. The guards mentioned her briefly as well. They spoke about her with a mix of confusion and suspicion. She wasn't part of the military personnel stationed on the island, but she had been captured during the incident and placed under guard like the others. From the fragments of their conversation, it sounded like the terrorists believed she might be connected to something bigger happening inside the base. As the soldiers continued talking, another detail slipped into their conversation, something that immediately caught my attention. One of them mentioned that there had been reports of an intruder somewhere inside the facility, someone who had managed to slip past the outer defenses and disappear into the base. The way they spoke about it suggested uncertainty. They didn't know exactly where the intruder was or how he had gotten inside. They only knew that someone was moving through the base unseen. I allowed myself a quiet breath in the darkness of the ventilation shaft. So the rumors had already begun spreading through the facility. Whether they realized it or not, the soldiers below were talking about me. Eventually, the guards moved away from the holding cells, continuing their patrol routes deeper into the corridor. Their footsteps faded, leaving the room below quiet again. I moved away from the vent opening and continued crawling forward through the narrow tunnel. The ventilation shaft curved deeper into the structure of the hangar before finally reaching another opening. At the end of the tunnel, the facility revealed itself in full scale. When I descended from the ventilation system and stepped onto the metal platform below, the enormous interior of the tank hangar stretched out before me. The space was massive, far larger than anything visible from the outside of the base. Industrial lights hung high above the floor, casting long reflections across the polished metal surfaces of military equipment stored inside. Armored vehicles and machinery lined the lower levels of the hangar, surrounded by catwalks and steel platforms that allowed personnel to move between different sections of the facility. The atmosphere inside the hangar was heavy with the scent of fuel and machinery. Guards moved along the walkways and across the floor below, their voices echoing faintly through the vast chamber as they communicated with one another. Surveillance cameras rotated slowly from their mounted positions along the walls, watching every corridor and staircase. From the elevated walkway where I stood, the central elevator of the hangar was clearly visible. It connected the different underground levels of the base, descending into deeper sections of the facility, where even more secrets were hidden beneath the frozen island. Somewhere below this hangar were the laboratories, command centers, and weapon systems that made Shadow Moses such an important military installation. And somewhere even deeper than that waited the weapon that had brought me here: Metal Gear. For a moment I stood still on the catwalk, taking in the scale of the place. The entire structure had been built with one purpose in mind: to house something powerful enough to justify this level of security and secrecy, something capable of changing the course of global warfare. As I moved quietly along the metal walkway, the echo of my own footsteps reminded me how deep inside the enemy's stronghold I had already traveled. The surface of the island was far above now. Outside, the snow continued to fall over the silent ocean. But down here, inside the steel skeleton of the base, the real story of Shadow Moses was beginning to unfold. And the deeper I went, the more dangerous that story was becoming. The elevator descended slowly into the lower levels of the tank hangar, carrying me deeper into the heart of Shadow Moses. When the doors opened, the atmosphere immediately felt different from the massive industrial space above. This floor was quieter, more controlled, more contained. The walls were reinforced with thick steel panels, and the corridors were lined with holding cells secured behind heavy electronic doors. The air carried the sterile scent of a detention facility rather than the mechanical smell of the hangar above. Somewhere on this level was the prisoner I had come to find. The codec signal in my ear confirmed it. The location beacon connected to DARPA Chief Donald Anderson was coming from somewhere nearby. I moved carefully through the corridor, staying close to the walls as I approached the row of cells. Through a small reinforced window in one of the doors, I could see him sitting alone inside. The DARPA chief looked older than I expected, his posture tense as he sat on the narrow bench fixed to the wall of the cell. Even from a distance, I could see the exhaustion in his expression. The man had clearly been through intense interrogation since the terrorists took over the facility. The cell block was silent, except for the faint buzz of fluorescent lights and the distant footsteps of guards moving through other parts of the base. But there wasn't a way to reach Anderson directly through the locked door. The only option was above. I found a ladder at the end of the corridor, leading back into the ventilation system that ran through the upper structure of the cell block. Climbing up, I crawled once again into the narrow metal tunnels that snaked through the ceiling of the facility. The vents here were positioned directly above the detention area, allowing me to see down through the metal grates as I moved slowly forward. Below me, a lone guard sat on a chair near the holding cells, clearly uncomfortable. Every few moments he sniffed loudly and wiped his nose on the sleeve of his uniform. The soldier had caught a cold in the freezing climate of the island, and the irritation in his expression made it clear that guard duty was the last place he wanted to be. Not far from him was another cell. Inside sat the woman the guards at the dock had mentioned earlier. She appeared calm despite her situation, sitting quietly against the wall as if she had already accepted whatever fate awaited her inside this place. Her presence here raised questions. Shadow Moses was a military installation. Civilians didn't belong in places like this. Yet here she was, locked in a cell beneath one of the most secure facilities in the world. I continued crawling until I reached the end of the ventilation shaft, where the metal tunnel opened directly above the DARPA chief's cell. Carefully, I lowered myself down into the room. The sudden sound startled Anderson, who turned quickly toward me as I landed on the floor. For a moment he stared, confused and uncertain. Then recognition flashed across his face. "You must be the one they sent," he said quietly. His voice carried both relief and exhaustion. I introduced myself simply. Solid Snake. Anderson didn't waste time with pleasantries. The situation at Shadow Moses was far worse than the outside world understood. According to him, the terrorists controlling the base had already forced him to reveal half of the nuclear launch codes connected to a classified weapons project. A project known as Metal Gear. Hearing the name spoken aloud inside the cell confirmed what intelligence had suspected. The terrorists weren't bluffing. Metal Gear was real, and it was somewhere inside this facility. Anderson explained that the weapon was a new model, an advanced nuclear platform capable of launching missiles from anywhere on Earth without detection. If the terrorists managed to activate it, they would possess the power to threaten any nation on the planet. But there was still one piece of information they didn't have. The launch sequence required 2 detonation codes. Anderson had already been forced to give them his half of the code under interrogation. The second code belonged to another man being held inside the facility, the president of Arms Tech, the defense company responsible for developing Metal Gear. Before the terrorists could fully activate the weapon, they needed that second code. Anderson pressed a small card into my hand as he finished speaking. It was an electronic keycard, encoded to unlock certain security doors inside the base. Level 1 clearance. With it, I could access sections of the facility that had previously been sealed off. He urged me to find the ArmsTech president as quickly as possible. If we could reach him before the terrorists did, there might still be a chance to stop them from launching the weapon. But before Anderson could say anything more, something strange happened. His expression suddenly tightened with pain. His breathing became uneven, and his body began trembling uncontrollably. At first, I thought it might be the result of the torture he had endured, but within seconds, it was clear that something far worse was happening. Anderson collapsed onto the floor of the cell, gasping for air. I moved quickly to help him, but there was nothing I could do. The man's heart stopped before my eyes. The suddenness of it felt unnatural. Anderson had been weak, but he hadn't looked like a man on the verge of death only moments earlier. The entire scene left an unsettling feeling in the pit of my stomach. As I stood there in the quiet cell, the codec activated again. Campbell and Naomi were both on the line this time. Naomi's voice immediately shifted into a clinical tone as she asked questions about Anderson's condition. From the details I described, she concluded that the cause of death was most likely a heart attack. But something about the explanation felt incomplete. The timing was too perfect, too convenient. Even Campbell seemed unsettled by the sudden turn of events, though he tried to keep the focus on the mission. Anderson had already given me the information we needed. The next step was to find the ArmsTech president before the terrorists forced the second launch code out of him. After the conversation ended, I remained inside the cell for a moment, listening to the faint sounds coming from the corridor outside. Something was happening beyond the walls. Footsteps, shouting. Then the sudden sound of gunfire echoing through the detention area. The noise grew louder, followed by the unmistakable sound of soldiers shouting in panic. The entire corridor outside erupted into chaos. Through the small window in the cell door, shadows moved rapidly across the floor as soldiers ran past. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. Silence returned to the cell block. A moment later, the electronic lock on the door released with a quiet, mechanical click. I stepped out into the corridor cautiously. The scene outside looked like the aftermath of a small battlefield. Several Genome soldiers lay unconscious or worse along the hallway, their weapons scattered across the floor. Whatever had happened here, it had been fast, and it hadn't been done by ordinary soldiers. As I moved forward, a figure suddenly appeared at the far end of the corridor. A man dressed in a strange armored exoskeleton, his entire body moving with unnatural speed and precision. A high-frequency blade gleamed in his hand as he cut through the remaining guards with terrifying efficiency. The soldiers never even had time to react. Within seconds, the corridor was silent again. I raised my weapon cautiously. The mysterious warrior turned toward me. For a moment, we stood there facing each other across the corridor. Something about the way he moved felt strangely familiar, as if I had seen that fighting style before. The man lifted his head slightly, his voice distorted by the mechanical mask covering his face. "You're that ninja," I said quietly. Before I could ask another question, he moved with incredible speed, firing a burst of gunfire that forced me back. Then he leapt toward the nearby elevator and disappeared inside before I could reach him. As the elevator doors closed, another presence revealed itself for only a brief moment. Floating silently above the ground was a tall figure wearing a gas mask and a long coat that seemed to drift through the air like smoke. The man didn't walk. He hovered, watching everything with eerie calmness. The image vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Naomi's voice returned through the codec, her tone uneasy as she identified the figure. Psycho Mantis, one of Foxhound's most dangerous members. A psychic specialist capable of reading minds and manipulating people through telepathy. Hearing that name only deepened the mystery surrounding this mission. Shadow Moses wasn't just a terrorist takeover. Something far stranger was unfolding inside the frozen fortress. And I had just stepped directly into the middle of it. The elevator carried me further down into the depths of the facility, deeper than the detention level where the DARPA chief had died only minutes earlier. Each level of Shadow Moses felt colder than the last, not because of the temperature, but because of the realization that everything happening here had been carefully planned long before I arrived. When the doors opened, I stepped into a section of the base that felt different from the rest. This area had the atmosphere of an armory, reinforced walls, storage rooms filled with military equipment, and corridors designed to protect whatever weapons were stored inside. The security here was tighter, the architecture heavier, as if the base itself understood how dangerous the materials kept here truly were. Before pushing deeper into the lower levels, I briefly returned to the previous floor to gather equipment that might help me survive what was coming. Shadow Moses was a place where preparation meant the difference between life and death. When I descended again into the armory level, the environment changed noticeably. The lighting was dimmer here, the corridors narrower. The floors were reinforced with thick metal plates, and the air carried the smell of explosives and fuel. This was where the base stored the tools of war. As I moved through the armory corridors, the sense of danger grew stronger. The terrorists controlling the base had set traps throughout the area, turning the armory into a maze designed to kill intruders before they ever reached its inner rooms. Every step forward demanded caution. Eventually, I reached a section of the corridor where the walls looked slightly different from the rest of the structure. The DARPA chief's final instructions echoed in my mind. Somewhere in the armory was a hidden path leading to the Arms Tech president, the man who held the second half of the nuclear launch codes. I examined the wall carefully. The color of the metal panels was just slightly off compared to the surrounding structure. Subtle enough that most people would walk right past it without noticing. But the difference was there. It was a hidden barrier. When the explosives detonated, the reinforced wall shattered outward with a violent blast that echoed through the underground corridor. Smoke and dust filled the air as pieces of steel and concrete scattered across the floor. Behind the destroyed wall was a narrow passage carved into the deeper structure of the base. This section of the facility felt older than the rest. The lighting flickered weakly along the walls, and the air was heavy with electrical interference. My radar system began to fail as I moved forward, the signal dissolving into static. Whatever equipment powered this section of the base was disrupting communication systems. It was clear that the terrorists had intentionally hidden this area from surveillance. The passage twisted deeper through the structure until it opened into a circular chamber, unlike anything else I had seen inside the base. The room looked like an improvised interrogation chamber. Thick pillars surrounded the center of the room, casting long shadows across the floor under the dim lighting. And in the middle of that room, tied to a metal frame surrounded by explosive devices, was the man I had been sent to rescue. Kenneth Baker, the president of Arms Tech. His face was pale, his body restrained by wires connected to blocks of plastic explosives positioned around the platform. Whoever had set up this trap wanted to make sure that any attempt to rescue him could end in disaster. I stepped forward cautiously, but before I could reach him, a slow clapping sound echoed through the chamber. The voice that followed carried a calm confidence, almost amused by the situation unfolding before him. "You're here sooner than I expected." I turned toward the voice and saw him standing across the room. Revolver Ocelot, one of the most infamous members of Foxhound. He looked exactly like the stories described him. Tall, composed, dressed in a long military coat with a revolver resting comfortably in his hand. His eyes carried the sharp focus of someone who had spent his entire life mastering a single craft: gunfighting. Ocelot was a man who treated combat like an art form. Every movement he made was controlled and deliberate, as if the entire situation had been carefully arranged for his entertainment. He explained that Baker was more useful alive than dead. The explosives attached to the president were simply insurance. If anyone interfered with the situation recklessly, the entire room would disappear in a fireball. His revolver spun effortlessly around his finger as he spoke, the metal catching the dim light of the chamber. Then the tension broke. Ocelot raised the weapon and fired. The chamber exploded into chaos as gunfire echoed between the pillars. The fight that followed felt less like a traditional battle and more like a deadly game of pursuit. Ocelot moved constantly, circling through the room with the confidence of someone who knew exactly how the battlefield worked. His revolver fired with precise rhythm, each shot deliberate. But despite his reputation, he wasn't invincible. The fight became a dangerous dance around the pillars, each of us trying to anticipate the other's next movement. Ocelot laughed occasionally during the exchange, clearly enjoying the challenge. To him, this wasn't just another military encounter. It was a test of skill. Eventually, the momentum of the fight shifted. My shots began to find their mark, forcing Ocelot backward as he realized the situation was turning against him. For the first time, the confidence in his expression cracked slightly. But before the fight could reach its conclusion, something else entered the room. A blur of movement flashed across the chamber so quickly that even Ocelot barely had time to react. The mysterious cybernetic ninja from the detention level suddenly appeared between us. The blade in his hand moved faster than the eye could follow. In a single fluid motion, he sliced through the wire surrounding Baker and cut across Ocelot's arm at the same time. Ocelot's revolver clattered to the floor as his severed hand dropped beside it. The explosives around Baker detonated immediately after, but the wires had already been severed. The blast filled the chamber with fire and smoke, yet Baker himself remained unharmed. Ocelot staggered backward in shock, clutching the bloody stump of his arm as he glared at the cybernetic warrior standing silently in the center of the room. Without another word, the ninja disappeared as quickly as he had arrived, vanishing into the shadows of the base. Ocelot retreated moments later, escaping through the corridor before anyone could stop him. When the smoke cleared, the room finally fell silent again. Baker remained tied to the metal frame, shaken but alive. I moved quickly to free him from the restraints. Once he could speak, Baker wasted no time explaining the situation. Like the DARPA chief before him, he had been forced to reveal the detonation code he carried. The terrorists now possessed both launch codes needed to activate Metal Gear. The situation had just become far more dangerous than anyone outside the base realized. Despite the grim news, Baker still had something valuable to offer. He handed me a small optical disc containing test data for Metal Gear, information that could reveal the weapon's weaknesses. Then he gave me another security keycard, granting access to deeper sections of the base. Baker also spoke about the lead engineer behind Metal Gear's design, a man named Hal Emmerich. If anyone understood the weapon well enough to help stop it, it would be him. Before the conversation could continue further, Baker's breathing suddenly became uneven. The same terrible pattern I had seen only a short time earlier in the DARPA chief's cell began repeating itself. Baker collapsed against the restraints, his body trembling violently before going completely still. Another heart attack, another sudden death that made no sense. Two key figures connected to the Metal Gear project, both dead under mysterious circumstances within the same facility. As I stood there in the silent chamber, holding the disc that contained the weapon's secrets, a terrible realization began forming in my mind. Something inside Shadow Moses was killing the people who knew too much. And whatever it was, it had already claimed 2 lives. After leaving the armory and the chamber where the Arms Tech president had died, the weight of the situation at Shadow Moses felt heavier than ever. 2 key figures connected to the Metal Gear project had collapsed from sudden heart attacks within minutes of speaking with me. The pattern was too precise to be coincidence. Something was happening inside this base, something neither Colonel Campbell nor Naomi seemed ready to explain. But there was no time to dwell on it. The mission had to continue. As I moved back through the corridors of the armory level, the base no longer felt as quiet as before. The terrorists were becoming aware that someone was moving through their stronghold. Guards now patrolled areas that had previously been empty, their movements more alert, their voices sharper when they spoke to one another through the radios clipped to their uniforms. Somewhere in the facility, someone had realized that the infiltration was real. While navigating the armory's reinforced hallways, Campbell contacted me again through the codec. His voice carried the familiar mixture of authority and concern. The deeper I moved into the base, the more security systems I would encounter. Some of them were invisible to the naked eye, infrared lasers designed to detect movement in restricted corridors. Campbell suggested contacting a weapons specialist who had joined the mission support team. A moment later, another voice entered the codec channel. Nastasha Romanenko. Her tone was calm and analytical, the voice of someone who had spent years studying weapons and the systems designed to protect them. She explained the type of infrared detection grids used inside facilities, like Shadow Moses. Security lasers that could seal entire rooms and flood them with deadly gas if triggered. Listening to her, I realized just how paranoid the designers of this facility had been. Every layer of security seemed designed to eliminate intruders without warning. Even so, Nastasha described the weaknesses built into such systems. The invisible beams could be revealed with the right tools. Once exposed, they could be carefully navigated through patience and awareness. War technology, no matter how advanced, always had a flaw somewhere. Eventually, after navigating deeper through the facility's layered defenses, I reached a section of the base that overlooked the enormous tank hangar once again. The industrial space felt strangely familiar now. The echoes of machinery, the distant footsteps of guards on metal walkways, the towering structure of the facility rising above the armored vehicles stored below. But I wasn't staying here long. My next objective waited outside the base. Somewhere beyond the reinforced doors of Shadow Moses was a path leading toward the nuclear storage buildings, where the Metal Gear project was hidden. Before leaving the interior of the hangar, I contacted the one person who might be able to help from the inside of the base, the woman imprisoned in the detention area. Her name was Meryl Silverberg. During our conversation over the codec, her personality revealed itself quickly. She was young, direct, and far more confident than someone in her situation should have been. Unlike the soldiers guarding the base, Meryl hadn't been broken by the takeover of the facility. If anything, she sounded determined to fight back. I expressed my concern about her involvement in the situation. Someone with her sense of compassion and moral clarity didn't belong in the middle of a military operation controlled by terrorists. But Meryl dismissed the concern almost immediately. She had chosen to be a soldier, and now that the base had fallen under enemy control, she intended to do something about it. Despite the tension surrounding the mission, there was something reassuring about hearing her voice. Someone inside the fortress still believed the situation could be changed. Meryl told me she would unlock one of the cargo doors leading outside the facility. From there, I could continue the mission toward the nuclear storage buildings. It took some time for her to override the security systems controlling the door, but eventually the signal came through. The path forward had been opened. When I returned to the massive cargo entrance on the northern end of the hangar, the steel doors slowly separated with a heavy mechanical groan. Beyond them waited a narrow corridor lined with silent security systems. Even here, the base was still trying to stop anyone from leaving unnoticed. I moved carefully through the passage, the invisible sensors watching every step. The corridor eventually led to a maintenance exit, And beyond that, the outside world. The moment I crawled through the final opening, the freezing wind of Alaska hit me again. The base behind me faded into the darkness of the mountain, while the landscape ahead opened into a long canyon carved through snow-covered rock formations. The ground was buried beneath thick layers of snow, broken only by jagged stones and frozen terrain that stretched toward the distant buildings of the nuclear storage facility. The silence of the canyon was unsettling. Unlike the mechanical noise of the base, this silence belonged to nature itself. Wind moved through the cliffs, carrying loose snow across the frozen ground. For a brief moment, it felt like I had stepped away from the war unfolding inside Shadow Moses. But that illusion didn't last long. The codec suddenly activated again, this time from an unfamiliar frequency. The voice that came through was calm but mysterious. The man refused to give his real name, choosing instead to identify himself only as Deep Throat. Whoever he was, he clearly had knowledge of the island and the dangers waiting in the canyon ahead. He warned me that the area had been heavily mined with claymore explosives. One wrong step in the snow could trigger a devastating blast. The warning arrived just in time. The snow-covered ground ahead hid the deadly traps almost perfectly. Without the warning, it would have been nearly impossible to cross the canyon safely. Slowly, I navigated through the narrow path between the rock formations, moving toward the far side of the valley, where the nuclear storage buildings rose from the frozen landscape. But before I could reach the end of the canyon, the ground suddenly trembled beneath my feet. The sound that followed was unmistakable, the roar of a tank engine echoing between the cliffs. From behind the snow-covered ridge ahead, a massive armored vehicle rolled into view. An M1 battle tank, its enormous cannon rotating slowly until it aimed directly at me. The hatch opened, and a towering man emerged from the turret. His size alone made him look less like a soldier and more like a giant standing above the armored machine. His voice carried across the canyon with the deep confidence of someone who had already decided the outcome of the encounter. This was Vulcan Raven, another member of Foxhound. Unlike the cold precision of Ocelot or the eerie presence of Psycho Mantis, Raven radiated raw physical power. His massive frame and calm demeanor suggested a warrior who had spent his entire life in battle. He spoke as if the confrontation had been inevitable. According to him, warriors were destined to cross paths on the battlefield, and this canyon would be the place where that destiny unfolded. The tank's cannon roared to life, and the quiet canyon erupted into the thunder of armored combat. Snow exploded into the air as shells slammed into the ground around me, the force of each blast shaking the frozen earth beneath my feet. The fight was brutal and relentless, but eventually the armored vehicle fell silent. Smoke drifted from the damaged machine as the canyon slowly returned to stillness. Vulcan Raven climbed from the hatch once more, his expression strangely calm despite the defeat of his weapon. He spoke one final time before withdrawing from the battlefield. According to him, our paths would cross again before the events at Shadow Moses reached their conclusion. With that warning hanging in the cold air, Raven disappeared back into the frozen landscape, leaving the destroyed tank behind. As the wind swept across the canyon once again, the mission continued forward. Beyond the cliffs ahead stood the nuclear storage facility. Somewhere inside that complex was the man who designed Metal Gear, Hal Emmerich. And if anyone understood the secrets of the weapon threatening the world, it would be him. The entrance to the nuclear warhead storage building felt different from every other section of Shadow Moses. The moment I stepped inside, the atmosphere changed. The facility was quieter here, almost unnaturally so. The cavernous interior stretched upward into darkness, lit by long rows of industrial lights suspended high above the floor. Beneath those lights stood the true reason this island existed: warheads, dozens of them. Massive cylindrical missiles lined the enormous storage chamber, each resting inside reinforced containment frames that stretched from the floor to the high metal ceiling. The sight alone carried a silent weight. These were not ordinary weapons. Each one held enough destructive power to erase entire cities from existence. Standing in the middle of that room felt like standing inside the heart of humanity's most dangerous invention. I stepped onto a narrow catwalk running along the upper structure of the storage chamber, carefully observing the environment around me. Guards moved quietly across the lower platforms, their patrols disciplined and steady. The soldiers stationed here behaved differently from the ones in the hangar or the armory. Their movements were more cautious, their voices lower when they spoke to each other. Even they seemed aware of the fragile nature of the weapons surrounding them. As I moved deeper into the storage building, the codec activated once again. Colonel Campbell's voice came through immediately, his tone more serious than before. "Snake, listen carefully," he said. "You're inside the nuclear storage area now." He explained that any weapon discharge inside the chamber could trigger catastrophic consequences. Even a single stray bullet striking the wrong surface could damage the containment systems protecting the warheads. Campbell wasn't exaggerating. The warheads stored in this facility were active nuclear devices. Any disruption to their shielding could release radioactive material into the air, contaminating the entire structure. Before I could respond, another voice joined the conversation. Naomi Hunter. Her tone was calm, but there was an unmistakable urgency behind her words. She explained that she had temporarily disabled my firearm systems remotely. The decision was not negotiable. Inside a room filled with nuclear weapons, there could be no risk of accidental gunfire. The explanation made sense, but it still left an uncomfortable feeling. Walking through enemy territory without access to a weapon was never ideal. Naomi reassured me that the restriction was only temporary. But for the moment, stealth was the only option. The codec transmission ended, leaving me alone once again inside the massive storage chamber. I climbed down from the catwalk and approached a large reinforced gate, blocking access to the deeper sections of the building. The metal door was built into the structure of the facility itself, heavy enough to survive a direct explosion. Beneath it was a narrow maintenance gap designed for ventilation systems and structural expansion, just wide enough for a person to crawl through if they were determined enough. Beyond the gate, the architecture of the facility changed again. The warhead storage chamber gave way to a maze of corridors and stairways leading to the administrative and technical sections of the building. Guards continued their patrols through the hallways, their boots echoing softly against the reinforced floors. Every movement here required careful timing. Being discovered in a place like this would be far more dangerous than any other section of the base. According to Campbell, if the guards detected an intruder inside the nuclear storage building, the entire area would immediately seal itself. Security systems would flood the corridors with toxic gas, eliminating the threat without risking damage to the warheads. The system was designed to protect the weapons above all else, even if it meant sacrificing everyone inside the building. Slowly, I made my way through the corridors until I reached an elevator connecting the upper levels of the structure. But before descending further into the facility, there was another floor to check first. The B1 office level. When the elevator doors opened again, the environment changed from industrial corridors to something closer to a military administrative center. Offices lined the hallways, their doors reinforced with the same heavy security systems found throughout the base. The fluorescent lighting flickered faintly above the empty desks and workstations scattered across the rooms. This was where the personnel responsible for maintaining the nuclear storage facility carried out their daily operations. The place felt strangely abandoned now. Papers still rested on desks. Computer monitors glowed quietly in darkened rooms. But the people who once worked here were gone, replaced by the soldiers of the terrorist takeover. I searched through the rooms carefully, moving between offices and storage areas that once supported the operation of the facility. Equipment meant for weapons, maintenance, and communication systems had been left behind during the chaos of the takeover. One room in particular held something that would prove useful in the mission ahead: a compact missile launcher system designed for remote guidance operations. Unlike conventional weapons, this device allowed the operator to control the missile's path after it had been launched. It was the kind of specialized equipment used for navigating tight spaces or striking targets hidden behind obstacles. Exactly the kind of tool that might be needed inside a facility built like Shadow Moses. With the device secured, I paused for a moment in the quiet office corridor. The deeper I moved into the base, the clearer the scale of the operation became. Shadow Moses wasn't just a military installation. It was a labyrinth of interconnected facilities designed to protect one of the most dangerous weapon systems ever built. Somewhere deeper inside the complex waited the man who understood Metal Gear better than anyone else: Hal Emmerich, the lead engineer responsible for designing the machine that now threatened the world. If there was any chance of stopping the weapon before the terrorists activated it, finding Emmerich was the next critical step. I returned to the elevator and prepared to descend once more into the depths of the nuclear storage building. The lower levels of the facility waited below, and with every step deeper into Shadow Moses, the truth behind the Metal Gear project was getting closer. The elevator carried me down once again, deeper beneath Shadow Moses, into the laboratory level of the nuclear storage building. By then, it felt as if every descent into the base took me one step further away from the ordinary world and one step closer to something hidden, unnatural, and deeply wrong. When the doors opened, I stepped into a corridor that felt colder than the others, not in temperature, but in atmosphere. The air itself seemed hostile. The lighting flickered across metallic walls and sealed rooms, and almost immediately I could sense that this part of the facility had been designed not simply to protect secrets, but to isolate them. There was only one path forward. As I moved into the room ahead, I caught sight of an electrical control unit positioned behind a series of barriers. At the same moment, the codec came to life. The familiar, mysterious voice returned. Deep Throat. He warned me to proceed carefully. The floor ahead had been electrified, and the surrounding area was filled with gas. Whoever had secured this section of the building had done so with the assumption that anyone reaching it would die there. It was another reminder that Shadow Moses was less a military base now, and more a layered trap, each corridor designed to break the will of anyone who tried to uncover the truth. The interference in the air made every breath feel heavier. Even standing there for too long felt dangerous. The whole environment carried the oppressive sensation of a place meant to suffocate intruders slowly and silently. But the electrical system controlling the trap had a weakness, and once that system was destroyed, the path deeper into the laboratory would open. When the power supply was finally destroyed, the tension in the room shifted. The crackle of electricity faded from the floor, but the air still carried the danger of the gas filling the hallways. The area remained toxic, suffocating, and claustrophobic. Moving through it felt like crossing through the inside of a machine that wanted to reject human presence entirely. As I searched the surrounding rooms, I found what I needed to survive in that environment longer: a gas mask. It was a small thing, but in a place like Shadow Moses, survival often depended on small things. Once I secured it and pressed forward, the laboratory began revealing what had really happened there. Past the security systems and the reinforced doors was a quarantine section. Even before I fully entered it, I could sense that something terrible had happened inside. The halls were silent in the worst possible way. Not calm, but dead. Then I saw them. Bodies. Scientists, scattered through the corridor, collapsed where they had fallen. Some looked as though they had tried to flee. Others had died where they stood, never given the chance. The fluorescent lights cast a pale glow over the massacre, making the blood on the floor look darker, almost black. It wasn't the aftermath of a firefight. It was something more intimate, more violent, more personal. Whoever had come through that laboratory hadn't simply killed them. They had carved a path through them. I moved slowly, every instinct on edge, trying to read the story written in the destruction around me. Then I saw movement ahead. A scientist was crawling desperately along the floor, dragging himself forward with what little strength he had left. He was trying to escape. But before he could get far, a figure appeared in the corridor beyond him. The cybernetic ninja. Silent, impossibly fast, and moving with the same terrifying efficiency I had already witnessed elsewhere in the base. In one swift motion, the blade came down, and the scientist's attempt to flee ended there in the hallway. The ninja then turned toward a reinforced security door and cut straight through it, slicing open a path into the room beyond, as if the steel barrier meant nothing. It was impossible not to feel the unnaturalness of it. The speed, the strength, the precision. He wasn't just another operative in this incident. He was something else entirely. I followed the path he had opened and entered the next room, where the truth waiting there was stranger than I expected. Huddled in the corner was another scientist, alive, trembling, terrified. He wore glasses, a lab coat, and the expression of someone who had never been meant for battle or bloodshed. This was Hal Emmerich, the man I had come to find. The lead designer of Metal Gear. The engineer responsible for creating the weapon hidden beneath Shadow Moses. Before I could speak to him, the ninja turned toward me. For a moment, everything in that room narrowed to the space between us. The frightened scientist in the corner, the dead silence of the laboratory outside, the metallic hum of the room, and the warrior standing before me like a ghost from another life. He spoke in a voice twisted by pain, obsession, and something deeper than hatred. He told me that he had only one purpose left: to fight me. There was no negotiation in his tone, no hesitation. Whatever had brought him to Shadow Moses, whatever had turned him into the thing standing in front of me, it all led back to that single desire. The battle that followed felt less like fighting an enemy, and more like being forced into the center of someone else's unresolved nightmare. He moved with impossible speed, shifting between aggression and silence, appearing and vanishing, driving the fight through the cluttered laboratory with inhuman intensity. There were moments when he attacked like a machine built purely for combat, and others when his movements seemed fueled by something more emotional, something personal. He wasn't just trying to kill me, he was confronting me, testing me, reaching for something through violence that words could no longer express. As the fight continued, he changed. At first he relied on the blade, lunging forward with enough force to split the air itself. Later, when the weapon was gone, he fought with his hands, as if stripping the battle down to something raw and direct. Then came the moments when he disappeared from sight, using a cloaking system to blur himself into the environment, turning the room into a game of sound, instinct, and memory. Even hidden, he kept speaking. Not like a soldier taunting an enemy, but like a wounded mind trying to pull its past back into focus. His voice echoed through the room in fragments, forcing me to listen as much as fight. There was something familiar in it, something I didn't want to believe. By the final stage of the battle, the man inside the machine was beginning to come apart. His movements became unstable. Electrical surges burst from his body. He started teleporting erratically across the room, trailing violent arcs of energy and signs of mechanical failure. It was as though the suit itself was no longer able to contain whatever rage, pain, and memory were trapped inside it. When he finally fell, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like the collapse of something tragic. He rose only long enough to break apart emotionally, as much as physically, then fled the room in a burst of instability, vanishing deeper into the base. The silence that followed was heavy and disorienting. For a moment, I simply stood there, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Then the codec activated. As I spoke, the truth I had been avoiding finally came into words. I knew who the ninja was. Gray Fox, an old comrade, a man I had once fought beside, a man who was supposed to be dead. I had seen him fall years ago in Zanzibar land, and yet somehow, impossibly, he was here, alive, transformed, and broken into something that was no longer fully human. Saying his name out loud made the whole situation feel even more unreal. Shadow Moses had already been filled with nuclear threats, genetic experiments, psychic soldiers, and unexplained deaths. But this was different. This was personal. Gray Fox wasn't just another danger in the base. He was a part of my past, dragged violently into the present. Once the shock of the battle passed, I turned to the man still cowering in the corner. Hal Emmerich looked nothing like the kind of person who should have been responsible for designing a machine like Metal Gear. He was nervous, awkward, visibly shaken by everything he had witnessed. He spoke quickly, almost apologetically, as though the words had been trapped inside him for too long. He insisted that he hadn't understood what Metal Gear was truly meant to become. He knew he had designed an advanced walking weapon platform, but not that it was intended to launch nuclear missiles. Hearing that, I watched his face carefully. There was real guilt there. Not the calculated guilt of a man trying to save himself, but the devastated realization of someone who had helped create something monstrous without fully understanding it. He regretted it immediately and deeply. Emmerich also knew something important. He knew where Meryl might be. I contacted her through the codec, and for a brief moment it seemed like maybe the connection would give us some direction. But the conversation ended abruptly. She had been discovered. The sudden cut in the transmission left a cold feeling in the room. Every time I got close to someone on that island, the mission seemed to tighten its grip around them. Before we separated, Emmerich gave me a higher security card, one that would open areas of the base that had been inaccessible until then. He also told me not to call him Emmerich. He asked me to call him Otacon, the nickname that came from his love of anime and computers. Under almost any other circumstances, it might have sounded ridiculous. But in that room, after everything that had happened, it felt human. A small, awkward attempt to hold on to identity in the middle of madness. Otacon explained that he could hide using a stealth camouflage suit, similar in principle to the one Gray Fox wore. It was almost absurd hearing a frightened scientist talk about vanishing from sight while standing beside the aftermath of a massacre. But by then, Shadow Moses had made absurdity feel routine. I told him to disappear and stay alive. He hesitated, but only briefly, then agreed. Before leaving, I found myself looking at him the same way I had looked at Anderson and Baker. Both of those men had died almost immediately after giving me what I needed. For a moment, I wondered whether Otacon would be next, but he noticed the concern in my voice and brushed it off, trying to sound steadier than he felt. Then he ran, vanishing from the laboratory to hide somewhere in the depths of the base. When he was gone, I stood alone in the ruined room, surrounded by broken equipment, scorched walls, and the memory of Gray Fox's voice. I now knew more than I had when I entered the laboratory, but the answers only made the mission darker. Metal Gear was real. Otacon had built it. Meryl had been caught. Gray Fox was alive. And every truth inside Shadow Moses seemed tied to suffering, guilt, or betrayal. There was only one thing left to do. Go back up to B1 and find Meryl before it was too late. After leaving the laboratory and the chaos that had unfolded there, I returned to the elevator and rode back up to the office level of the nuclear storage building. The ride upward felt strangely quiet. My mind was still turning over everything that had happened in the laboratory below. Gray Fox. Alive. Otacon. A man who had unknowingly helped build a weapon capable of launching nuclear warheads. And somewhere inside this base, Meryl had been captured. When the elevator doors opened again, the office floor looked eerily calm. Rows of rooms lined the corridor, their fluorescent lights buzzing softly overhead. The place had once been an administrative center where technicians and military staff coordinated the operations of the nuclear storage facility. Now it felt abandoned, like an empty shell left behind after a storm. I moved slowly through the offices, scanning the halls for any sign of activity. Eventually, I noticed a soldier leaving one of the rooms in the central office area. His movements were different from the others I had seen patrolling the base. There was hesitation in the way he walked, a slight stiffness that didn't quite match the disciplined posture of the genome soldiers. Something about him felt off. Instead of confronting him immediately, I decided to follow. The soldier walked calmly down the hallway and turned into the women's restroom. The moment he disappeared inside, I knew something was wrong. Genome soldiers didn't make mistakes like that. I waited a moment before entering. Inside the bathroom, the lights flickered quietly above a row of empty stalls. The silence in the room felt tense, almost like someone holding their breath. I moved slowly toward the last stall at the end of the row. The door creaked slightly as it opened. And there she was. Meryl Silverberg. She had removed the helmet and mask of the genome soldier uniform she had been wearing as a disguise. Without it, she looked younger than I expected. Strong-willed, determined, but also human in a way that many of the soldiers on this island no longer seemed to be. For a moment, we simply looked at each other. Then she broke the silence with a quiet smile. "Not bad," she said, referring to the fact that I had managed to figure out her disguise. The tension between us eased slightly after that. The two of us stood there in the quiet restroom, while the chaos of the base continued somewhere outside those walls. During our conversation, the topic eventually turned to war. It wasn't a strategic discussion or a tactical debate. It was something deeper than that. I spoke about my past, about the things soldiers carry with them long after the battle's end, the memories, the guilt, the feeling that war never really leaves you, even when the fighting stops. Meryl listened carefully. She had the enthusiasm of someone who still believed in the ideal of being a soldier. But hearing those words forced her to confront the reality behind the uniform she wore. She wasn't naive. She simply hadn't experienced enough yet to see the darker side of it. Despite everything happening around us, there was a strange calm in that moment. Two people standing in a bathroom in the middle of a nuclear weapons facility, talking honestly about things soldiers rarely say out loud. Before we separated, Meryl handed me something important. A special key used within the facility's nuclear launch systems, along with a higher-level security card that would allow access to deeper sections of the base. With those items, I would be able to reach the base commander's office, the next critical step in stopping whatever the terrorists were planning. When the conversation ended, Meryl placed her disguise back on and prepared to move on her own. She had her own role to play in the mission now. As I stepped out of the restroom and back into the office hallway, I immediately noticed something strange. The music that had been playing faintly throughout the facility had stopped. The corridor was silent. The guards that had been patrolling earlier were gone. It felt like the building itself had paused for a moment, as if the entire base was preparing for the next stage of whatever was unfolding inside Shadow Moses. I stood there for a moment in the quiet office hallway, gathering what supplies I could before continuing forward. Ahead of me was a long corridor leading toward the base commander's office, and somewhere beyond that door waited more answers about the truth behind Metal Gear. The hallway leading to the base commander's office felt strangely tense, even before anything unusual happened. Meryl walked beside me as we approached the heavy security door at the end of the corridor, the one that required the highest level of access we had encountered so far. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Then suddenly, she stopped. Her body stiffened, as if something had seized control of her. She grabbed her head with both hands, breathing unevenly. The sudden change in her expression was immediate and disturbing. One moment she looked focused and determined. The next, she seemed lost, frightened by something only she could feel. "What's happening to me?" she whispered. The moment passed just as quickly as it had begun. Her posture relaxed, and she looked back at me, almost embarrassed by what had happened. She brushed it off like it was nothing more than a brief, dizzy spell. But something about the way she recovered felt unnatural, like someone flipping a switch inside her mind. We continued forward and entered the base commander's office. The room was large, furnished like a high-ranking officer's command center. Heavy desks, filing cabinets, communication equipment, and shelves lined the walls. But there was no one there. The office was completely empty. The silence inside the room felt heavier than the air outside in the hallway. It felt like walking into a place where someone had just left moments before. I stepped further into the room, scanning the surroundings carefully, trying to understand what we had just walked into. Then I noticed Meryl moving behind me. When I turned around, she was standing near the entrance again. But something had changed. Her posture was rigid, her movements slow and unnatural. She raised her weapon and pointed it directly at me. The expression on her face wasn't anger. It wasn't even determination. It was emptiness. Her eyes looked distant, as though she were watching events unfold from somewhere far away. "Snake," she said softly. "I can't control my body." The codec activated immediately. Naomi's voice came through urgently. She had already realized what was happening. Someone inside the room was manipulating Meryl's mind, a psychic presence. Psycho Mantis, one of Foxhound's most dangerous members. According to Naomi, he possessed the ability to enter another person's consciousness and control them completely. Meryl wasn't acting on her own. She was being used like a puppet. Naomi told me there was only one option. I had to subdue her without seriously hurting her. It was the only way to break the psychic hold controlling her body. The moment I moved, Meryl attacked. She fought with the skill of a trained soldier, but there was something mechanical about the way she moved, as if her actions were being directed from somewhere outside her own mind. Each time she stumbled or hesitated, she whispered apologies under her breath. Her voice trembled with frustration. She could feel herself being forced to fight, but she couldn't stop it. Eventually, the psychic grip controlling her weakened enough for her to collapse unconscious on the floor. For a moment, the room went completely silent again. Then a slow clapping sound echoed from the shadows. The air shifted. A figure began to rise slowly from the ground itself. Psycho Mantis. He floated in the center of the room, his long coat drifting around him as if moved by invisible currents. A gas mask covered his face, hiding whatever expression might have been behind it. His presence filled the room with an oppressive feeling, like standing too close to something unnatural. Mantis spoke calmly, his voice echoing with quiet confidence. He explained that the human mind was an open book to him. Thoughts, memories, fears. He could see them all. To him, people weren't mysteries. They were simply stories waiting to be read. He turned his attention toward me and began describing fragments of my past, as if he were flipping through the pages of a diary. Things I had never told anyone. Things I barely allowed myself to remember. According to him, my mind was filled with the memories of battlefields and death. He said that war had become the only thing I truly understood. Then he laughed softly, as if amused by the contradictions inside my thoughts. To him, human consciousness was nothing more than entertainment. When the confrontation began, the entire room seemed to come alive around us. Chairs lifted from the floor. Desks shifted across the room. Books and objects began swirling through the air as if caught inside a storm. Mantis moved effortlessly between moments of visibility and invisibility, striking from unexpected angles as though he could predict every action before it happened. Even when he vanished from sight, his presence remained in the room. The faint distortion in the air, the sound of furniture shifting, the pressure of his attention watching from somewhere unseen. The fight felt less like combat and more like being trapped inside someone else's mind. Halfway through the confrontation, Mantis reached out again with his psychic abilities and seized control of Meryl once more. Her body lifted from the floor like a puppet, pulled by invisible strings. When she regained consciousness, her eyes were wide with fear. She knew what was about to happen before it even began. Mantis forced her to raise the gun toward herself. Her hands trembled as she struggled to resist the command. She begged for help between desperate breaths. Snake. I can't stop it. The moment stretched painfully as the psychic pressure forced her closer and closer to pulling the trigger. But the control shattered before that moment could happen. Meryl collapsed again, unconscious but alive. The psychic hold finally broke. When the battle resumed, Mantis's power began to fade. The room slowly settled as the objects he had been manipulating crashed back to the floor. Eventually, the floating figure staggered backward, weakened by the effort. His body lowered slowly toward the ground. For the first time, his voice sounded different. Not arrogant, not confident, just tired. As he lay there at the edge of death, the mask of the psychic warrior finally slipped away. He spoke quietly about his past, about growing up surrounded by hatred, about discovering his psychic powers and being forced to hear the worst thoughts inside every person he encountered. The cruelty, the violence, the darkness hidden inside human minds. Those voices had driven him into isolation, into madness, into becoming the man now lying on the floor. But before dying, he did something unexpected. He helped. He told me about a hidden passage behind one of the bookshelves in the room, a path that would allow me to continue deeper into the base. For someone who had spent his life reading the worst parts of humanity, helping someone else in his final moments seemed to surprise him. Using my power to help someone, he murmured quietly. That actually feels good. With those words, Psycho Mantis died. The silence that followed felt strangely peaceful compared to the chaos that had filled the room moments earlier. Meryl slowly regained consciousness and stood up beside me, still shaken by everything that had happened. She asked me something simple before we left the office. My name. I looked at her for a moment before answering. I don't have a name, I said. Names don't mean anything on the battlefield. Together we moved the bookshelf aside, revealing the hidden passage Mantis had described. Beyond it was the next section of the base, and somewhere ahead, the path that would finally lead to Metal Gear. The hidden passage behind the base commander's office eventually led outside the steel skeleton of the facility and into a completely different world. The narrow corridor opened into a series of natural caves carved deep into the frozen rock of Shadow Moses Island. The moment I stepped inside, the atmosphere changed again. The artificial lights of the base were gone, replaced by the dim glow of lamps mounted along the cave walls. The air smelled colder, rawer, filled with the scent of damp stone and snow drifting in from the outside. Then I heard them. Wolves. Their howls echoed through the cavern tunnels, rising and falling like distant signals in the darkness. Listening to them for a moment, I recognized something about their sound. These weren't ordinary wolves. They were wolf dogs, animals bred for strength and endurance, the kind often used in northern regions for sled teams. I had encountered them before during missions in harsh climates. That knowledge didn't make the situation much safer. A pack of wolf dogs guarding a narrow cave system could be just as dangerous as armed soldiers. Meryl stopped beside me at the entrance of the caves. The dim light reflected off the rock walls as she listened to the distant howls. Then she turned toward me with a confident smile. She offered to move ahead through the caves and meet me at the other side. The idea was simple. If the two of us moved separately, it would make it harder for anyone tracking us to predict our path. Before leaving, she gave me one last glance, half reassurance, half challenge, before disappearing deeper into the tunnels. Left alone in the cave system, I moved forward carefully. The sound of the wolf dogs echoed unpredictably through the twisting passages. Sometimes the noise felt distant. Other times, it sounded like it was right around the corner. The caves themselves felt alive in their own quiet way, the wind whispering through narrow gaps in the rock, while snow filtered in through cracks in the stone above. Eventually, the tunnels opened into another chamber. The wolf dogs were there, their eyes reflecting the faint cave light as they watched my movements carefully. They didn't attack immediately, but their presence made it clear that this territory belonged to them now. Moving slowly, I navigated through the winding passages of the cave system, careful not to provoke the animals any more than necessary. The deeper sections of the caves twisted through narrow openings and low rock formations that forced me to crawl through parts of the tunnels just to continue forward. After some time navigating the maze of rock and ice, the path opened into another chamber. And there, waiting calmly near the exit of the caves, was Meryl. The moment she appeared, something unexpected happened. The wolf dogs that had been watching from the shadows approached her quietly and then sat beside her as if she were their handler. They lowered their heads and remained completely calm. Meryl glanced down at them with a small smile before looking back toward me. "I thought you were good with dogs," she said teasingly. There was something peaceful about the moment. After everything that had happened inside the base, mind control, psychic battles, nuclear threats, the quiet presence of the animals felt strangely grounding. For a brief moment, the war unfolding around Shadow Moses seemed far away. When we were ready to move again, Meryl led the way toward the exit of the caves. Beyond the door ahead, the mission would continue deeper into the island. The exit of the caves led into a narrow underground passage carved through the rock beneath Shadow Moses. Compared to the cold openness of the canyon outside, the corridor felt tight and oppressive. The walls were made of rough stone, reinforced with metal supports, and the floor stretched forward in a long, straight line that seemed to disappear into the distance. It looked simple at first glance, but the moment we stepped inside, Meryl immediately raised her hand to stop me. She had noticed something dangerous. Mines. The entire passage had been seeded with claymore explosives, carefully hidden along the ground where a careless step would trigger them instantly. Meryl studied the corridor for a moment before turning back toward me. "Follow my footsteps," she said quietly. Her tone carried the calm confidence of someone who had trained for situations exactly like this. Then she stepped forward, carefully placing each foot along a safe path she had identified. The journey across the corridor felt slow and tense. Every movement had to be deliberate. One wrong step would turn the entire passage into an explosion. Meryl moved ahead, guiding the path while I followed behind, watching the ground carefully as we advanced through the minefield. Eventually, we reached the far end of the corridor. The tension began to ease slightly, as it looked like we had made it through safely. But just as Meryl stepped forward into the open space beyond the mines, the sound came. A single gunshot. Sharp, precise, echoing through the passage like a crack of thunder. Meryl staggered forward as the bullet struck her shoulder. The impact threw her off balance, and before she could recover, another shot rang out. Then another. Each one landed with terrifying accuracy. She collapsed onto the frozen ground of the corridor, her body falling limp as the silence returned, just as suddenly as it had been broken. "Sniper!" I shouted, immediately dropping low to the ground. Whoever had taken those shots was positioned somewhere far down the corridor, hidden beyond the reach of the naked eye. The passage itself was a sniper's dream, a long, perfectly straight shooting lane with nowhere to hide. I rushed to Meryl's side. She was still breathing, but barely. Blood stained the snow beneath her uniform as she struggled to remain conscious. Her eyes fluttered weakly as she tried to focus. The codec activated almost immediately. Colonel Campbell's voice came through first, alarmed by the sudden change in the situation. Naomi joined the conversation moments later, analyzing the attack. According to her, there was only one person on Shadow Moses capable of making shots like that from such a distance. Sniper Wolf, one of Foxhound's elite operatives. Naomi explained that Wolf was known throughout military circles as one of the most dangerous marksmen in the world. Her patience and precision were legendary. Once she had a target in her sights, escape was almost impossible. That realization made the situation painfully clear. The corridor itself had been designed for this exact trap. Anyone attempting to cross it would be forced into the open, exposed to the perfect line of fire from a sniper waiting in the distance. I stayed beside Meryl as long as I could, trying to keep her conscious while the distant scope remained trained on us. But without a weapon capable of reaching that distance, there was no way to fight back. The only option was to retreat. I contacted Otacon through the codec, hoping he could provide a solution. His voice came through quickly, filled with concern when he realized what had happened. After a moment of searching through the base's equipment inventory, he told me exactly what I needed to hear. There was a sniper rifle stored back in the armory section of the tank hangar, a PSG-1, a weapon specifically designed for long-range combat. Hearing that meant only one thing. I would have to go all the way back through the base to retrieve it. Leaving Meryl behind in that corridor was one of the hardest decisions I had made during the mission so far. But there was no other way. Without a sniper rifle, trying to reach the end of the passage would only lead to the same fate she had suffered. The trip back through Shadow Moses felt longer than before. The base had become more alert now, the enemy soldiers more active, as the infiltration continued to unravel their control over the facility. But eventually, I reached the armory once again and recovered the weapon Otacon had described. Holding the sniper rifle, I could feel the balance of the mission shift slightly. Now the battlefield would change. The return to the underground passage was quieter than before. The corridor was still exactly as I had left it. The minefield, the frozen air. Meryl lying unconscious near the edge of the passage where the sniper's bullets had struck her down. Somewhere far down the corridor, hidden behind the distant structures and snow-covered rocks, Sniper Wolf was waiting. When the confrontation finally began, it felt less like a chaotic battle and more like a duel between two soldiers who understood the rules of long-range combat. The corridor became a deadly game of patience. She would appear briefly, rifle raised, searching for the perfect shot, then vanish again before the next moment arrived. Each time she revealed herself, even for a second, the opportunity came to fire back. Slowly, the duel unfolded across the frozen corridor, the silence between shots stretching longer with every exchange. Eventually, the moment came when her movement slowed. The distant figure collapsed into the snow, her rifle falling beside her as the corridor finally fell quiet. For a brief moment, it looked like the battle was over. With the sniper threat eliminated, I moved forward through the passage toward the doors at the far end. But the victory felt too easy, too clean. As soon as I reached the end of the corridor, the truth revealed itself. Soldiers emerged from the surrounding area, surrounding the passage from every direction. The entire encounter had been a trap from the beginning. Sniper Wolf herself appeared once again, unharmed, watching calmly as the soldiers closed in around me. She had never intended to die in that corridor. The entire duel had been a setup designed to draw me forward into the ambush. With Meryl unconscious and no clear path out, the situation had finally turned against me. I lowered my weapon slowly. For the first time since arriving at Shadow Moses, the mission had reached a moment where resistance was no longer possible. The screen faded into darkness as the soldiers moved in to capture me. The last voice I heard before everything went silent was strangely familiar. And then the world disappeared. Consciousness returned slowly, like surfacing from deep water. The first thing I felt was the cold metal pressing against my wrists and ankles. My body was restrained, strapped tightly to a chair beneath a harsh ceiling light. The room around me smelled of oil, steel, and something else, something metallic and unpleasant that suggested this place had seen more than its share of suffering. When my vision finally cleared, two figures stood in front of me. One of them I already knew. Revolver Ocelot. His expression carried the same quiet amusement I had seen before, as if everything happening here was part of an elaborate performance he had been waiting to conduct. But the second figure standing beside him was someone new. A tall man with blonde hair and a confident posture, dressed in a dark military coat that moved slightly as he stepped closer. His face held an unsettling familiarity, like looking into a reflection that had been twisted just enough to feel wrong. He smiled faintly as he studied me. "So this is Solid Snake," he said calmly. "My brother." The words hung in the air longer than the silence that followed them. This was Liquid Snake, the leader of the Foxhound Rebellion, the man responsible for taking control of Shadow Moses and threatening the world with nuclear weapons. According to him, the two of us shared something deeper than military history. We shared blood. Liquid spoke openly about it, explaining that we were both products of the same secret project, the cloning program created from the genetic material of Big Boss. The military had taken the DNA of one of the greatest soldiers who ever lived and attempted to replicate it. Not once, but multiple times. Liquid described it as an experiment designed to determine which traits of Big Boss would create the perfect soldier. In his mind, the two of us were the result of that experiment. Brothers born from the same source, raised on opposite sides of the battlefield. As he spoke, it became clear that everything happening at Shadow Moses was part of something larger. Liquid believed that the world had treated him unfairly from the moment he was created. According to him, the cloning program had divided Big Boss's genetic traits between us. The dominant genes had been given to me, the recessive ones to him. He believed that meant the world had decided from the beginning that I was meant to be superior. That belief had shaped his entire life. Every battle, every decision, every piece of anger he carried with him now. But the conversation ended abruptly when Liquid received news that the American government had rejected the terrorists' demands. The tension in the room shifted instantly. Liquid's calm confidence hardened into frustration. With a final glance toward me, he turned and left the chamber. Sniper Wolf followed silently behind him, her presence as cold and distant as ever. That left only one person in the room: Ocelot. He stepped forward slowly, adjusting his gloves as though preparing for delicate work. Then he explained what was about to happen. According to him, interrogation wasn't about asking questions. It was about breaking the will of the person sitting in the chair. His method was simple. He would apply increasing electrical shocks to my body. The goal wasn't necessarily to kill me. It was to push me to the point where I would choose to give up. Ocelot made one thing very clear before he began. I could surrender at any time, but if I did, Meryl would die. He delivered that statement with complete calmness, as if describing the rules of a game. Then the torture began. The pain arrived instantly. Electricity surged through the restraints, sending violent waves through my body that forced every muscle to tighten at once. The shock felt like fire running through my veins. Each pulse left the world spinning for a moment before the next one arrived. Ocelot watched the entire process with clinical curiosity, occasionally commenting on how impressive it was when someone managed to endure longer than expected. Time lost its meaning during those moments. The only thing that mattered was holding on, refusing to give him the satisfaction of surrender. Eventually, the session ended. Ocelot studied me for a moment before nodding in approval. "Strong mind," he said quietly. Then he ordered the soldiers in the room to remove the restraints. I was dragged away from the chair and thrown into a nearby prison cell. The door slammed shut behind me with a heavy metallic sound that echoed through the corridor. The cell was small, dimly lit by a weak light mounted above the door. For a moment, I simply lay there, letting my body recover from the shocks. Then I noticed something lying against the wall of the cell, a body. The uniform was unmistakable. The DARPA chief. But something about the body didn't make sense. The condition of the corpse was wrong. Anderson had died only hours earlier during our conversation in the detention block. Yet the body lying here showed signs of decomposition that should have taken days, maybe longer. The realization sent a cold feeling through my chest. Something about the entire situation surrounding Anderson's death was wrong. Very wrong. When I contacted Campbell and Naomi through the codec, the confusion only deepened. According to the condition of the body, Anderson had been dead far longer than anyone believed. The timeline didn't add up. The man I had spoken to earlier couldn't have been alive. Yet I had watched him die with my own eyes. Campbell avoided answering too many questions, insisting that the truth would become clear later. That explanation didn't help. It only made the mystery surrounding Shadow Moses more disturbing. Eventually, I contacted Otakon. When he heard that I had been captured, he immediately promised to come help however he could. His voice carried the nervous urgency of someone who had never expected to be involved in something this dangerous. But before he could reach the cell, the guards returned. I was dragged back to the torture chamber for another round. The second session was worse than the first. The shocks lasted longer, and Ocelot seemed almost disappointed when I continued refusing to surrender. When it ended, I was thrown back into the cell once again. This time, something unexpected happened. The guard posted outside the cell suddenly rushed away down the hallway, clearly dealing with some personal emergency. The moment he disappeared around the corner, another figure slipped quietly into the corridor. Otakon. He looked terrified just being there, but he had come anyway. He approached the cell door quickly and unlocked it, whispering urgently as he handed me several items he had brought. Among them was a handkerchief that belonged to Sniper Wolf. Otakon spoke about her with a strange mix of admiration and sympathy, insisting that despite everything she had done, he believed she was still a good person. I didn't argue with him. There wasn't time. Before leaving, he also gave me a higher-level security card that would open more sections of the base. Then he activated the stealth camouflage suit he had been carrying and disappeared down the hallway, leaving me alone again. With the guard still gone, an opportunity presented itself. When the guard eventually returned and saw what appeared to be blood pooling on the floor of the cell, he panicked and opened the door to check on what he believed was a dead prisoner. That mistake gave me the chance to overpower him and escape. I moved quickly through the torture chamber once the door opened, reclaiming the equipment that had been taken from me earlier. But just before leaving, I discovered something else. Hidden among my supplies was a small explosive device, a final trap placed there by Ocelot, designed to detonate if I carried it too long without noticing. Removing it quickly prevented the bomb from doing its job. With the trap disarmed and my equipment restored, I stepped back into the detention block, where the mission had taken a darker turn hours earlier. The path forward was open again. Shadow Moses was still waiting, After escaping the torture chamber and reclaiming my equipment, the mission led me back toward the underground passage, where everything had changed hours earlier. Passing through the caves again, the wolf dogs that had once been hostile now watched silently as I moved through their territory. The handkerchief belonging to Sniper Wolf carried her scent, and the animals recognized it immediately. Instead of growling or preparing to attack, they simply stepped aside, allowing me to pass. When I entered the long underground corridor where Meryl had been shot, the memories returned instantly. For a brief moment, I saw it again, as clearly as before. Meryl stepping forward through the minefield, the sudden crack of the sniper rifle, the way her body collapsed into the snow. The image lingered long enough to remind me how much had already been lost during this mission. A call from Campbell broke the silence, pulling me back to the present. There was still work to do. At the far end of the corridor waited the next section of Shadow Moses, the communication towers. The moment I passed through the security doors leading into the tower structure, the alarm systems activated. Red emergency lights flooded the stairwell as sirens echoed through the metal structure. The tower interior was a narrow vertical fortress made of steel staircases and platforms spiraling upward through the building. Soldiers immediately began rushing down the stairs from above, while others moved in from below. The tower became a battlefield the moment I stepped inside. The climb was relentless. Flight after flight of metal stairs stretched upward into the towering structure, each level echoing with gunfire and the sound of boots pounding against steel. Guards appeared constantly, emerging from stairwells and platforms in an attempt to stop the advance. The entire ascent became a desperate race toward the top, while the alarm continued to echo through the tower. The higher I climbed, the more exhausted my body became. The structure itself seemed endless, the spiral of stairs repeating over and over until it felt like the tower had no end at all. At one point, I reached a door halfway up the tower, hoping for a shortcut or a moment of relief, but it was frozen shut. Otakon confirmed through the codec that the door often sealed itself in the extreme cold of the Alaskan climate. There was no choice but to keep climbing. Eventually, after what felt like an endless ascent through gunfire and chaos, the alarm finally faded. The tower fell silent again as I reached the upper levels. For the first time since entering the structure, there was a moment to breathe. The roof access door stood ahead. When I stepped outside, the freezing wind of Alaska rushed across the rooftop platform. The entire base stretched out beneath the night sky, its lights glowing against the endless snow surrounding Shadow Moses Island. In the distance stood the second communication tower, the one I needed to reach, but before I could move toward it, the sound of missile fire ripped through the air. A barrage of rockets streaked across the sky and slammed into the structure ahead, tearing the tower apart in a violent explosion. Flames and debris collapsed into the darkness as the destroyed tower crumbled under the attack. A familiar voice echoed through the chaos. Liquid Snake. His helicopter hovered nearby, the Hind D gunship circling the tower like a predator guarding its territory. Liquid's voice came through the loudspeaker of the aircraft, mocking the situation with calm amusement. He taunted me for climbing all that way, only to find the path destroyed. According to him, if I wanted to continue the mission, I would have to face him directly. The Hind D opened fire immediately after. Machine gun rounds tore across the rooftop platform, forcing me to take cover behind the concrete structures lining the edge of the tower. The helicopter moved in wide circles overhead, firing missiles and heavy rounds that shook the rooftop with each impact. It was clear that Liquid had no intention of allowing me to reach the next section of the base alive, but there was still a way forward. At the edge of the tower, I noticed a narrow section of the structure where it might be possible to descend along the outside of the building. The rope I had recovered earlier suddenly made sense. Attaching it to the edge of the tower, I began rappelling down the side of the massive structure while the helicopter continued its attack above. Steam vents along the tower walls released bursts of scorching air, forcing careful movement as the descent continued. Bullets struck the structure nearby as liquid tried to track my movement from above. It felt like descending through a storm of gunfire and steam while suspended hundreds of feet above the frozen ground. When my feet finally touched the lower platform of the tower, the immediate danger from the helicopter faded slightly. But the path forward wasn't clear yet. Soldiers positioned across the nearby catwalk attempted to block the route to the second communication tower. The fight that followed was brief, but intense, ending with the path finally cleared. Inside the second tower, I discovered something crucial: a Stinger missile launcher, a weapon capable of targeting aircraft, the kind of weapon that could finally bring Liquid's helicopter down. Before confronting the gunship again, I contacted Otacon. He had managed to reach the tower structure as well, and was working on restoring the elevator systems. During the conversation, he asked a question that seemed strangely philosophical for the middle of a battlefield. He wanted to know what it meant to be a soldier. The answer I gave him wasn't heroic. It wasn't poetic either. Being a soldier meant surviving. It meant fighting because there was no other choice. With the elevator temporarily restored, I climbed the tower once more, navigating through its narrow staircases until I reached the roof again. This time, the confrontation with Liquid was inevitable. The Hind D rose into view, its massive rotor slicing through the cold air above the tower. Liquid's voice echoed again through the loudspeaker, taunting me one last time about the legacy we shared as sons of Big Boss. Then the helicopter opened fire. The battle that followed unfolded across the rooftop under the night sky of Shadow Moses. Missiles streaked across the air, while the gunship circled above the tower, searching for the perfect angle to attack. But the Stinger launcher changed the balance of the fight completely. Each time the helicopter exposed itself, the missile lock would engage, sending a rocket screaming through the sky toward the aircraft. The Hind D maneuvered aggressively, trying to stay below the line of sight of the rooftop. Liquid attempted to use the tower structure itself as cover, appearing suddenly to fire before disappearing again. But eventually, the helicopter made one mistake too many. A final missile struck the aircraft directly. The explosion lit up the night sky as the Hind D spiraled downward, flames trailing behind it as it fell into the darkness beyond the tower. For a moment, the battlefield went completely silent. Liquid had escaped the crash, but the immediate threat was gone. The path forward had finally opened again. Otacon contacted me once more through the codec, informing me that the elevator systems were operational. The mission could continue. As the elevator descended through the tower, Otacon noticed something strange. The weight sensors inside the lift indicated more people inside than there should have been. Before we could react, the truth revealed itself. Soldiers wearing stealth camouflage suddenly appeared within the elevator. They had been hiding there the entire time, waiting for the moment the elevator began moving. The fight inside the confined space was exhausting after everything that had already happened. But eventually, the soldiers were subdued, and the elevator continued its descent. When the doors finally opened at the lower level, the corridor ahead was lined with automated gun cameras, watching every inch of the hallway. The tower had one last obstacle before allowing the mission to continue. With the cameras disabled and the corridor finally cleared, I stepped outside once again into the freezing air of Shadow Moses. Somewhere ahead waited the next stage of the mission, and beyond that, the hangar where Metal Gear itself was hidden. The communication tower eventually gave way to open ground once again. When I stepped outside the structure, the world of Shadow Moses stretched out before me in cold silence. The snowfield surrounding the base was vast and empty, broken only by scattered cliffs and frozen trees standing against the wind. The night sky above Alaska hung low and dark, the falling snow catching the faint glow of distant facility lights. Looked peaceful at first glance, but places like this were never truly quiet. The moment I began moving across the snow, The world suddenly shifted. A sharp sound cracked through the air. A bullet tore through the snow beside me with terrifying speed. Instinctively, I dropped low, realizing immediately what was happening. A sniper had already found me. The perspective of the battlefield felt as if it had narrowed into a single line, stretching across the frozen landscape. Somewhere beyond the trees, hidden among the shadows of the snow-covered terrain, Sniper Wolf was watching through her scope. I contacted Otacon through the codec immediately. His voice carried the same nervous concern I had heard before. I asked him if there were any more stealth camouflage suits available, anything that might give me an advantage against a sniper waiting somewhere in the distance. But before he could answer, another voice interrupted the transmission. Calm, cold, familiar. Sniper Wolf herself. She spoke through the communication channel as if the entire situation were already decided. Her voice carried a quiet confidence that only someone with absolute control over the battlefield could possess. Wolf mocked the idea that Snake could hide from her. According to her, once a sniper chooses a target, the outcome is inevitable. I fired back verbally, accusing her of making a mistake by revealing herself through the transmission. But Wolf only laughed softly. It didn't matter where she was. In a place like this, with the open snowfield stretching endlessly between us, the advantage was already hers. The communication ended there. The duel had begun. The battlefield became a test of patience. The snowfield offered very little cover, forcing careful movement between the few rocks and ridges scattered across the frozen ground. Somewhere beyond the trees, Wolf watched through her rifle scope, waiting for the perfect moment to fire again. Each shot echoed across the empty field like thunder in the distance. The snow kicked up around me each time the bullet struck, reminding me how precise her aim truly was. But patience worked both ways. Slowly, carefully, I began scanning the distant tree line, searching for the faintest sign of movement. Sniper Wolf was good, one of the best. But even the best sniper eventually has to reveal themselves for a fraction of a second when they prepare to fire. The duel stretched across the snowfield in tense silence between shots. Eventually, that moment came. A movement behind the trees, a figure stepping briefly into view. One precise shot broke the rhythm of the battlefield, and the duel ended. When the silence returned, the snowfield felt heavier than before. I approached the spot where she had fallen. Sniper Wolf lay against the snow, her rifle resting beside her as the cold air drifted quietly through the trees. She was still alive, but only barely. When she looked up at me, there was no anger in her eyes, only exhaustion. She asked me to finish it. The request wasn't desperate. It was calm, almost peaceful. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she began telling the story of how she had come to this place. Wolf had grown up surrounded by war. Her childhood had been shaped by the sound of gunfire and the struggle to survive in a world where violence had become normal. She explained that when people grow up in that environment long enough, war stops feeling like chaos. It becomes home. That was the life she understood. That was the world she had been shaped by. The only person who had ever shown her compassion was Big Boss. He had taken her in, given her purpose, and taught her how to survive in the world she had been born into. To her, Big Boss was more than a commander. He was the only family she had ever known. Listening to her story, it became clear that this battle had never really been about hatred. It was about loyalty, about two soldiers standing on opposite sides of a conflict shaped by the same man. Wolf looked toward the falling snow above her, her breathing becoming slower. "You're a good sniper," she said quietly. "Better than me." Then she closed her eyes. I raised my weapon. The shot was quick. The snowfield returned to silence. Moments later, footsteps approached from behind. Otacon arrived, running across the snow with visible panic when he saw what had happened. The moment he reached us, and realized who was lying in the snow, his entire expression collapsed. He knelt beside Wolf's body, struggling to understand how the situation had come to this. His voice trembled as he asked the question he had been holding back since the mission began. Why did soldiers keep fighting, even when they knew the cost? I didn't have an answer that would comfort him. War rarely offers answers that make people feel better. Otakon stood slowly after a moment, still shaken by everything he had witnessed. But despite the grief and confusion, he knew the mission wasn't over yet. Somewhere inside Shadow Moses, Metal Gear was still waiting. And as long as that weapon existed, the fighting couldn't stop. Before leaving the snowfield, I gathered what supplies remained, scattered across the battlefield. The frozen landscape felt quieter now, as if the island itself had paused to acknowledge the end of the duel that had taken place there. When everything was ready, I moved toward the massive reinforced door, standing at the far end of the snowfield. Beyond it waited the next section of Shadow Moses, and somewhere further ahead, the hangar where Metal Gear itself stood hidden. Beyond the frozen battlefield where Sniper Wolf had fallen, the path forward led deeper into the industrial heart of Shadow Moses Island. The next section of the facility was the blast furnace complex, a massive industrial chamber built for heavy metal processing. When I entered the structure, the air changed again. The warmth of the furnace systems mixed with the metallic scent of machinery and steam. Thick pipes ran along the walls and ceiling, while enormous cranes moved slowly above the catwalks, carrying massive loads through the cavernous chamber. The environment felt dangerous, even without enemies. Steam burst from vents along the walkways, machinery groaned constantly in the background, and the entire structure vibrated with the energy of the industrial systems surrounding it. Crossing the furnace chamber required moving along narrow catwalks, suspended high above the glowing industrial pits below. The cranes glided across the rails overhead like silent giants, their shadows sweeping across the platforms beneath them. The deeper I moved through the facility, the quieter the building seemed to become. Eventually, the furnace complex gave way to another section of the base, an elevator platform descending into the deeper levels of Shadow Moses. As the elevator began its descent, the tension of the mission returned quickly. Several Genome soldiers suddenly stepped onto the lift, attempting to block the path forward. The encounter was brief, but intense inside the confined metal chamber. When the elevator finally reached the next level, the environment had changed completely. The heat of the furnace was gone. Instead, the air had become colder, with every step deeper into the facility. Snow-like frost coated the metal walls as the lighting shifted to a pale blue glow. The atmosphere felt almost unnatural, as if this section of the base had been transformed into a frozen tomb beneath the island. As I descended further into the underground levels, another call came through the codec from Master Miller. His voice carried a strange tension this time. He spoke about Naomi Hunter, the geneticist supporting the mission, suggesting that something about her behavior seemed suspicious. According to Miller, he believed Naomi might be hiding something from the rest of the team. The warning lingered in my mind as the elevator continued its slow descent. When the doors finally opened again, the air was freezing. Ravens circled overhead inside the massive underground chamber, their black wings cutting through the cold air as they gathered across the frozen floor. The place felt less like a facility and more like some ancient battlefield waiting for its final confrontation. And standing in the center of that frozen chamber was a figure I had already faced once before. Vulcan Raven. The enormous warrior stood motionless among the ravens, his massive weapon resting calmly in his hands. The giant Gatling cannon he carried looked almost fused to his body, as if it were simply another extension of his strength. He had been waiting there the entire time. When he spoke, his voice echoed across the chamber like distant thunder. Raven did not greet me with anger or hatred. Instead, he spoke about destiny. According to him, our battle had been inevitable from the beginning. Two warriors brought together by forces far larger than either of us could control. Raven believed the battlefield revealed the true nature of a person, and he had been waiting for the moment when he could test my spirit directly. The battle that followed unfolded across the frozen warehouse floor. Raven moved with surprising speed for someone of his enormous size, the heavy weapon roaring to life whenever he found an opening to attack. The frozen chamber echoed with the sound of gunfire and the thunder of his weapon as the confrontation continued through the maze of containers and industrial structures surrounding the battlefield. But eventually, even a warrior like Raven could be defeated. When the battle finally ended, the giant collapsed onto the frozen floor as the ravens slowly gathered around him. Instead of anger or defeat, there was something almost peaceful in his expression. As he lay there, Raven spoke again, this time with the calm tone of someone who already understood his fate. He revealed something that finally explained one of the mysteries surrounding the mission. The man I had met earlier in the prison cell, the one I believed was the DARPA chief, had never been the real DARPA chief at all. That man had been Decoy Octopus, another member of Foxhound, capable of perfectly impersonating others. The real DARPA chief had already been dead long before I ever entered that prison cell. Suddenly, the strange details from earlier in the mission began to make sense. The body I had seen later in the torture chamber, the one that appeared far more decomposed than it should have been, had been the real DARPA chief all along. Decoy Octopus had been manipulating the situation from the beginning. Raven's voice grew quieter as the ravens gathered around him. He spoke about fate, about warriors, and about the strange paths that bring enemies together on the battlefield. According to Raven, the ravens themselves could sense death approaching long before it arrived. They had followed my journey across Shadow Moses because they could feel that my destiny was tied to the island's final battle. Then he looked toward the ravens surrounding him and gave a final prophecy. The ravens would not feed on his body. Instead, he believed they would follow me, because the battlefield ahead would soon become even bloodier than the one we had just fought. With his final breath, Vulcan Raven collapsed completely into the frozen snow. The ravens descended around him, their wings beating slowly in the cold air as they gathered around their fallen warrior. The chamber fell silent again. Before leaving, I recovered the key Raven had been carrying, the highest security clearance within the entire base. Level 7. With that key, the final sections of Shadow Moses were now open. Somewhere ahead in the deepest part of the island waited the hangar, where Metal Gear itself was being prepared. The mission was entering its final stage. The deepest chamber of Shadow Moses finally opened into the place where everything had been leading since the mission began. The Metal Gear hangar was enormous, a massive underground silo carved into the rock beneath the island. The structure stretched upward into darkness, surrounded by towering steel platforms, ladders, and catwalks built to service the weapon resting in the center of the chamber. And there it was. Metal Gear X. The nuclear walking weapon stood like a mechanical titan in the middle of the hangar, its massive legs planted firmly on the metal platform, while its armored body loomed above the entire room. Every part of it looked engineered for destruction. The railgun mounted along its back was the most terrifying piece of all, a weapon designed to launch nuclear warheads without the use of conventional missiles, making them nearly impossible to detect or intercept. Looking at it from below, the scale of the machine made it clear that this was never meant to be a defensive weapon. This was a machine built to rewrite the rules of nuclear warfare. As I climbed the platforms surrounding the hangar, Otacon's voice continued to reach me through the codec. He had begun analyzing the files recovered from the ArmsTech president earlier in the mission, trying to understand exactly how Metal Gear could be stopped. While I moved closer to the upper levels of the hangar, Otacon explained what he had discovered about the weapon he himself had helped design. Rex was capable of launching nuclear strikes in a completely new way. Instead of firing missiles into the sky like traditional nuclear weapons, it could launch a warhead directly using a railgun. The projectile would leave no detectable launch signature, no heat plume, no missile trail. By the time enemy satellites realized a nuclear weapon had been fired, it would already be too late to stop it. Hearing Otacon describe the true purpose of the machine only made the situation worse. The weapon he had helped build had the potential to destabilize the entire world if it ever fell into the wrong hands. As I reached the upper platforms of the hangar and moved across the structure surrounding Rex itself, the scale of the weapon became even clearer. Standing on the platform beside the machine felt like standing next to a skyscraper made of steel and armor. But the hangar wasn't empty. As I approached the final corridor overlooking the central control systems, voices echoed from the other side of the sealed door ahead. Liquid Snake and Revolver Ocelot. They were already inside the control room. Their conversation revealed the truth behind several events that had happened earlier in the mission. They spoke openly about Foxidy, the mysterious virus that had caused both the DARPA chief and ArmsTech President Baker to die suddenly. According to them, the virus had been responsible for eliminating anyone who knew the true launch codes for Metal Gear. The plan had been carefully designed from the beginning. They never needed the codes themselves. All they needed was someone capable of activating the system for them. And that someone was me. Listening from the other side of the door, something else became clear. Liquid knew I was there. He and Ocelot were speaking loudly enough for me to hear every word. It was a trap, but it was also an invitation. Before the conversation ended, one final detail emerged. Meryl was still alive. Liquid mentioned her casually, almost as if her survival had been planned all along. Before I could react further, Otacon contacted me again through the codec. He had discovered something important in the system files about the final step required to disable the launch sequence. Metal Gear's nuclear launch protocol was protected by a special key known as the PAL key. Instead of multiple keys, the system used a single card that could change its authentication signature depending on its temperature. At room temperature, the key would generate one code. When cooled, it would generate a second. And when heated, it would produce the final code required to disable the system completely. 3 codes. 1 key. If all 3 were entered into the control terminals in the correct order, the nuclear launch sequence would be permanently disabled. It sounded like the solution we had been searching for. But before I could move forward, the situation changed instantly. Ocelot suddenly noticed my presence outside the door. A gunshot rang out from inside the control room. The bullet struck the door and knocked the PAL key from my hand, sending it flying into the depths of the hangar below. Sirens erupted throughout the chamber as the base entered full alert mode. I descended back toward the lower levels of the hangar, searching through the dark water pooling along the floor beneath the structure until I finally recovered the key again. With the card back in my possession, the plan seemed simple enough. Activate each terminal in sequence, using the key in its 3 different temperature states. The first terminal accepted the key at normal temperature without issue. The system confirmed the code successfully. To generate the second code, I returned to the freezing chamber where Vulcan Raven had fallen earlier. The cold environment slowly altered the PAL key's internal circuitry until it produced the second authentication code. Returning to the hangar once again, I inserted the cooled key into the next terminal. The system confirmed the second code as well. Only one step remained. To complete the sequence, the key needed to be heated. That meant returning to the blast furnace area. During the journey back through the facility, the situation began to unravel in unexpected ways. Master Miller contacted me again through the codec, asking questions about Foxdie and the strange events surrounding the mission. His tone sounded different this time, more probing, more curious than before. Then Campbell interrupted the transmission with urgent news. Naomi Hunter had been arrested. According to intelligence reports, she had been acting as a spy. The revelation didn't make sense at first. Naomi had been helping the mission from the beginning. But before Campbell could explain further, another codec signal suddenly broke through. Naomi herself. She revealed the truth behind her actions in a calm but emotional voice. Naomi admitted that she wasn't even the real Naomi Hunter. She had assumed the identity years earlier while hiding from the world. The real reason she had joined this mission was far more personal. Frank Yeager, Gray Fox, had once saved her life when she was a child, orphaned by war. He had become the closest thing she had ever known to family. When he died years earlier during the Zanzibar land incident, she blamed the man responsible for his death. Me. Injecting Fox dye into my bloodstream at the start of the mission had been her way of delivering revenge. The virus had been designed to kill specific targets based on their genetic code. She had hoped it would eventually kill me as well. But before she could reveal the final truth about Fox dye's design, the transmission was suddenly cut off. Naomi had been taken away. The conversation ended without answers. Returning to the blast furnace area, the PAL key slowly heated to the temperature required for the final authentication code. When I brought the key back to the control room and inserted it into the final terminal, the system immediately responded. But instead of disabling the launch sequence, alarms erupted throughout the facility. The truth became clear instantly. The PAL key had never been meant to stop the launch. The 3 codes had actually activated it. I had unknowingly completed the final step required to prepare Metal Gear for launch. A final codec call came through immediately afterward. Master Miller again. But this time the voice on the other end of the signal had changed completely. Campbell interrupted the conversation with shocking news. The real Master Miller had been dead for 3 days. The person who had been speaking to me through the codec all along was someone else entirely. Miller's voice laughed quietly, and then the truth finally emerged. The man behind the voice was Liquid Snake. He had been manipulating the mission from the very beginning, guiding every step that led to the activation of Metal Gear. The terrorists had never needed the nuclear launch codes. They had needed someone else to unlock the system for them. Someone capable of reaching the control terminals inside the hangar. Someone like Solid Snake. With the launch sequence now active, the control room filled with deadly gas in an attempt to eliminate me before I could interfere further. But Otakon managed to override the door controls from his position in the system. The door opened just in time for escape. Stepping out of the control room, I saw him waiting at the far end of the corridor. Liquid Snake stood there calmly, as if the entire situation had gone exactly according to plan. The trap had finally closed. And now, the final confrontation was about to begin. Liquid Snake stood waiting at the far end of the catwalk overlooking the enormous Metal Gear hangar. The alarms that had been screaming throughout the facility slowly faded into the background as the 2 of us faced each other across the steel platform. I raised my weapon and demanded the truth. Why had he spent the entire mission disguised as Master Miller? Why manipulate every step of the operation? Liquid didn't seem bothered by the question. In fact, he almost looked amused. Calmly, he explained that the disguise had made it easier to guide me exactly where he needed me to go. The entire mission had been built around deception. According to him, the true objective had never been to stop Metal Gear. The real plan had been far more subtle. Fox dye, the virus Naomi had injected into my bloodstream before the mission began. Liquid revealed that the entire operation had been designed to use me as a delivery system. Fox dye had been programmed to target specific individuals based on their genetic structure. By sending me into the heart of Shadow Moses, the virus had quietly eliminated the people who knew the nuclear launch codes. Decoy Octopus, Arms Tech President Baker. The virus had already done its work, but Naomi had interfered with the design before the mission began, altering the virus in ways no one fully understood. Liquid admitted that even he didn't know exactly how Fox Dye would behave now. Then the conversation turned to something deeper, something far older than the mission itself. Liquid revealed the truth about our origin. We were twins, both of us created through a secret government project known as Les Enfants Terribles, an experiment meant to preserve the genetic legacy of Big Boss. According to Liquid, the experiment had divided Big Boss's genes between the two of us. I had received the dominant genes, the ones considered superior. Liquid had been left with what he called the recessive genes. To him, that meant he had been cursed from the moment he was created. Everything he had done since then, the rebellion, the war on Shadow Moses, had been driven by a single purpose: revenge against the system that had defined his entire existence before he was even born. With that final revelation, Liquid turned and climbed into the cockpit of Metal Gear RX. The giant machine roared to life as its massive systems activated throughout the hangar. I moved quickly across the loading platform, knowing there was no other option left now. The only way to stop the nuclear launch was to destroy Metal Gear itself. The battle that followed was unlike anything before it. Rex towered over the hangar floor, its massive mechanical limbs shifting as the machine locked onto its target. Missiles launched from its armored frame, exploding across the metal platforms surrounding the chamber. The railgun system remained silent for now, but the rest of the weapons arsenal was more than enough to turn the entire hangar into a battlefield. Otacon's voice came through the codec during the chaos. He explained that when he designed REX, he had left a flaw inside the system, a weakness hidden within the radar dome mounted along the machine's structure. Destroying that component would disable Rex's targeting system and force Liquid to expose the cockpit. That was the only way to reach him. The battle continued through waves of explosions and mechanical thunder as the giant machine stalked across the platform. Eventually, the radar dome shattered under the repeated attacks, forcing the cockpit to open. For a moment, it looked like the battle had finally ended. Rex staggered and collapsed partially onto the platform, but the victory lasted only seconds. The machine suddenly moved again. One of its massive legs lifted, preparing to crush me beneath the weight of the entire weapon. And then another figure stepped between us. Gray Fox. For the first time since learning his identity, I called him by his real name. He responded almost jokingly that it sounded much better than the nickname he had used before, Deep Throat. Fox had been the mysterious ally helping me throughout the mission from the shadows. Now he stood directly in front of the towering machine, holding it back long enough to create an opening. In that brief moment between life and death, Fox spoke about the past. He admitted something he had never told Naomi. Years ago, during one of the wars that shaped his life, he had been responsible for the death of her parents. The guilt from that moment had followed him for the rest of his life. That was why he had taken Naomi in as a child and raised her as if she were his own sister. Before I could respond, Fox charged toward Metal Gear again. His attack wasn't meant to defeat the machine. It was meant to buy time. Rex struck back with overwhelming force, crushing him against the metal wall of the hangar. Even as the machine pinned him in place, Fox continued speaking calmly. He told me to keep fighting, to stop letting the past control the future, to fight for something I believed in. Liquid fired again from inside the cockpit. Gray Fox died where he stood. The hangar fell silent for a moment after that. Then the battle resumed. With the cockpit now exposed, the final phase of the fight began. Metal Gear Rex still towered over the battlefield, but the weakness Otacon had described was now visible. The machine roared across the platform one last time as the final attack struck home. When the explosions faded, the enormous weapon collapsed into the metal floor of the hangar. Rex was finally destroyed. But the conflict wasn't over yet. When I regained consciousness, I found myself tied up on top of the ruined body of Metal Gear. Liquid stood nearby, looking almost disappointed by the destruction of the machine he had fought so hard to activate. He began speaking again, reflecting on the life of soldiers like us. According to him, the world had no real place left for people shaped by endless war. Soldiers existed only to fight. Without war, their lives had no meaning. Liquid accused me of enjoying the battlefield, that the reason I kept returning to missions like this was because part of me loved the violence. Then he revealed something else. Meryl was still alive. The Pentagon had already decided to eliminate Shadow Moses completely. B-2 bombers were already on their way to destroy the island, along with anyone still trapped on it. During the codec conversation that followed, Campbell tried to explain what had happened behind the scenes. The Secretary of Defense had been secretly supporting the entire operation. But before Campbell could finish the explanation, the Secretary himself interrupted the call, declaring Campbell relieved of duty for treason. The situation had collapsed into total chaos. With the island about to be destroyed, Liquid made one final decision. If the world had no place for soldiers like us, then there was only one way to settle things. A final duel. Liquid released me and armed a bomb next to Meryl. 3 minutes. If I failed to defeat him before the timer ended, the bomb would kill her. The final fight took place on the wreckage of Metal Gear itself. Steel twisted beneath our feet, while the wind howled across the exposed hangar platform. There were no weapons left, no machines, just 2 soldiers shaped by the same genetic legacy, fighting one last time to prove which of them would survive. The duel was brutal, but brief. Eventually, Liquid lost his footing and fell from the ruined structure. For a moment, it seemed like the battle had finally ended. I rushed to Meryl's side and freed her from the restraints holding her down. But the mission wasn't over yet. The entire base was collapsing around us as the airstrike approached. Following Otacon's directions, we ran through the final corridors of Shadow Moses toward an underground vehicle bay. Inside the garage waited a military jeep, the only chance to escape before the island was destroyed. Meryl took the driver's seat, while I climbed into the mounted machine gun behind her. Soldiers flooded into the garage as we broke through the security barriers one after another, racing down the long runway leading out of the base. Just when the exit seemed within reach, another vehicle burst from the smoke behind us. Liquid Snake. Somehow he had survived the fall. The final chase unfolded across the narrow tunnel leading out of the base. The 2 vehicles slammed into each other repeatedly as gunfire echoed through the enclosed corridor. Eventually, the tunnel opened into the outside world, but both vehicles crashed violently into the snow before reaching safety. Meryl and I struggled to move, trapped beneath the wreckage of the jeep. Liquid approached slowly through the snow, weapon raised for the final kill. But before he could pull the trigger, his body suddenly froze. Fox die. The virus Naomi had altered finally activated inside his body. Liquid collapsed onto the snow beside the wreckage. His war was over. Moments later, Campbell contacted us again. The truth behind the mission finally came out. The Secretary of Defense had been acting alone, manipulating events in an attempt to gain control over Metal Gear. With him removed from power, the official cover-up of the Shadow Moses incident had already begun. Campbell switched the call to Naomi. She spoke calmly, almost gently, explaining that Fox die was unpredictable now because of the changes she had made. No one knew when or if the virus would activate again inside my body. She left me with one final message. Life isn't determined by the genes we inherit. The future belongs to the choices we make ourselves. With the mission finally over, Meryl and I walked across the snowy landscape outside the destroyed base. Nearby, a snowmobile waited exactly where Campbell said it would be. Before leaving, we found a bandana left behind inside the vehicle, a small reminder of everything that had happened on the island. As we rode away into the frozen wilderness of Alaska, the war at Shadow Moses finally came to an end. Far away from the battlefield, another quiet conversation took place. Revolver Ocelot spoke through a secure line to a mysterious figure he referred to only as Solidus. The truth behind Metal Gear and the future conflicts still waiting in the shadows had only just begun.